Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing this evening? Doing good? Good deal. Well, as Todd said, my name is Logan Metesh. I run a company called High Caliber History. I'm an arms historian. By show of hands, who's heard of James Henry Burton? Couple? All right. Well, that's about normal, what I would expect. He's a fascinating individual who, unfortunately, very few people are aware of who he was, and the jury is still out. People seem to have either loved Mr. Burton or hated him, which is why I titled it A Most Unscrupulous Partisan with Untiring Skill and Diligence, because those are both quotes that people attributed their way of describing him. But he was an absolutely influential arms designer for 3 different nations. And without him, we would not have the current technology that we do today, because everything stands on the arms and the shoulders of those that came before. So, to start off Burton's early life, he was born in rural Virginia in 1823. He went up to Pennsylvania and attended the Westchester Academy there. At 16, he moved to Baltimore and took an apprenticeship on the B&O Railroad. He served there for 5 years as an apprentice in the machine shop. And then in 1844, he went to the Harper's Ferry Armory as a machinist there. And it kind of tied in a little bit with his history with the B&O Railroad, since the railroad ran right past Harper's Ferry. While he's working there, he meets up with John Hall at the Hall's Rifle Works, which of course is just down the river there from the Harper's Ferry Arsenal. And the two of them really bonded over the concept of innovation in arms and the idea of interchangeability of parts, which was still in its infancy at that point. That would prove to be a game changer in the decades to come. And so Hall brought that concept there, and Burton kind of ran with the concept. And it was while he was at Harper's Ferry that Burton's talent was really first spotted by the men working in the Armory. He was promoted to foreman, and then he was promoted to the assistant inspector just within a year in 1845. It was a nice promotion for him. He was making a whopping 22.5 cents an hour, and he was doing pretty well. There was a quote from Major John Symington, who was the head of the Armory and the Arsenal there, and he said this of Burton. He said, quote, "His ingenuity in devising, drafting, and perfecting tools and machines caused me at once to select him as master armorer on the occurrence of a vacancy." That's high praise coming from Major Symington. And so in 1849, Burton was promoted to the acting master armorer. He was 26 years old, and it provided him again with a nice raise. This time he's doing a little better. They paid him $800 a year salary, as well as his housing there at the Armory, and a cord of wood for the fireplace. And in 1854, this is where things take a little bit of a step back. The Armory, of course, being government run, and Harper's Ferry for a while, it had waffled back and forth between civilian contractors running it and the government running it. And there was a lot of back and forth tension over how it should be handled. And of course, when you're dealing with the government, politics obviously come in. And at one point, Congressman Faulkner referred to him as, quote, "a rabid Whig and a most unscrupulous partisan." And unfortunately, as it often is, when a congressman speaks, right or wrong, people listen. And it resulted in Burton being demoted to the master machinist, which is quite a fall to go from the master armorer down to just a machinist. And Burton wasn't going to stand for that kind of a slight, and so he chose to resign. In 1855, the government adopts the mini-ball, which we're all familiar with by being used on both sides in the Civil War. Most people want to credit the mini-ball, and of course because of the name, with Claude Monet, the Frenchman. But it was actually created in 1848, and this is Burton's design, his drawing that was discovered in 1855. He refined the concept of the mini ball and gave it the shape that we all know today. And so even though it bears Claude Monet's name, it's really Burton's design, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact to the politics that were going on with the Whigs that he got caught up in, and also the fact that he is a Virginian, and so when the Civil War breaks out, he goes to the South, and of course there's partisan issues there, and it becomes easy for them to sweep Burton under the rug, and I guess they'd rather name it after a Frenchman than a Virginian. So he decides that he's not going to let things get him down after having been removed and resigned from Harper's Ferry, and he heads to Massachusetts and goes to work for the Springfield Armory up there. And he's kind of double dipping up there because while he's working at Springfield, he's also a consultant for the Ames Manufacturing Company, which makes a wide variety of firearms manufacturing equipment, but they also make swords and a variety of other utilitarian pieces of equipment. And he was then in charge of making the arms-making machinery that was being used at Springfield Armory and at Harper's Ferry Armory. And so he was designing all of those machines to help revolutionize the way they were going to produce arms. Again, going back to John Hall in wanting to mechanize things and do some mass production and uniform parts, and he's helping develop the machinery for that. And he's also working on an order that Ames has received from Great Britain. And as he's working on those designs, has anyone heard of the Blanchard Lathe? No? Okay. Well, the Blanchard Lathe, they have the original one up at Springfield Armory. It's a stock duplicating machine, and it was named after Mr. Blanchard, who developed it. And that was the first step in creating uniformity to the stocks. And so they had a master stock on the lathe, and it would spin, and it had a stylus that would control the cutting so that they could duplicate these stocks. And Burton was working with the Blanchard Lathe design and helping to improve that design as well. And he decides that, Springfield Armory just isn't cutting it. I can be doing more. He was always looking for more. He wanted to advance. And so that same year, he leaves Harper's Ferry, he goes to Springfield, he's working with Ames, and now he's going to hop on a boat and go across the pond because he gets poached by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. And so he goes over there. They're paying him 400 pounds a year, which is about $500 or so. So certainly a pay cut compared to the 800 he was making as the master armorer, but they're paying for his housing and his expenses. He comes on there as the superintendent and assistant engineer, and he's in charge of 1,200 employees, so he's doing quite well for himself. In 1856, he meets a machinist turned gunsmith by the name of Joseph Whitworth. Folks know the Whitworth name? We ought to, yeah. But this is the one stumbling block in Burton's brilliance throughout his life. He dismissed the idea of the hexagonal rifling, and he didn't think what Whitworth was doing was going to catch on. And of course, as we know in this room, it goes on to be a very prized sharpshooting rifle in the South during the Civil War. So that was his one little hiccup that he had there. He didn't see the brilliance behind that design. But despite that, he is still getting a lot of notice. In 1856, the London Times paper wrote an article about him and referred to his having a singular excellence due to his untiring skill and diligence. While he was there, they were putting out a whopping 75,000 pattern 1853 Enfield rifled muskets per year. And not only were they making 75,000, they were making them incredibly well with insanely tight tolerances. He prided himself on the fact that each one of those guns, the tolerance was 3/1000ths of an inch. That's pretty darn good, if you ask me. And it goes on to explain why the Enfield was such a prized rifle here in the Americas during the Civil War. And so as he's gaining notoriety for his incredible machinery work at Enfield, that gun gets picked up everywhere. They're using it in England, in the United States, Austria, Portugal, Sweden, and Russia. And he starts getting headhunted by other governments. Russia is one of them that ends up coming into play a little later on, but he's at that point content with his job at Enfield. He feels his talents are being used properly. He's enjoying the high quality arms that they're putting out, but things are going to take a bit of a turn for him after 1858. 1859 comes along, and that is an insanely pivotal year for him in his life. He takes a spring trip back home to Virginia, and he marries Eugenia Mawsey. One of 3 of his wives, 2 of which were in the Mawsey family. But this is a very pertinent time in his life, particularly in Harper's Ferry, because in October of 1859, John Brown raids the place, and there is actually an extant letter that Burton and Eugenia get from her parents after the raid, and her mother says, quote, "Last night a band of ruffians took possession of the town. Our men chased them in the river, and I saw them shot down like dogs. My dear husband shouldered his rifle and went to join our men. Even while I write, I hear the guns in the distance." And that was Eugenia Mawsey's mother, Mary, John Burton's mother-in-law. Now, a little note on the family. Again, I mentioned he was married 3 times, 3 wives. Cornelia from 1844 to 1850, Elizabeth 52 to 58, and Eugenia from 59 until his death in 1894. He was a very busy boy, 17 children total between the 3 wives. And some of his sons were also involved in the arms industry in a variety of different ways and in different time periods. His son Charles worked for Spiller and Burr during the Civil War, which was a Confederate revolver factory. His son James worked for an ammunition company in Canada in the 1880s and 1886. And his son Frank, the most famous of them all, Frank Burton, worked for Winchester Repeating Arms and worked for them well into the 20th century. And there are a wide number of Winchester patents on very popular 20th century arms that were taken out in his name because he created them. So Frank did some really impressive stuff while he was at Winchester. So it really ran in the family blood to be a gunsmith. In the summer of 1860, Burton resigns from Enfield. In public, what he makes known, he says that he's suffering health problems due to the climate there in England. Now, he was a sickly man through most of his life, so people bought that. And they said, oh, well, you know, yeah, it is a little bit more damp here than it is in Virginia, so maybe it really is his health. But privately, what he admitted in letters was that he had to come home and help Virginia prepare for war. So he came back to Virginia, and he was hired by J.R. Anderson and Company. Anderson owned Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, and he wanted Burton's, quote, knowledge and influence in getting things off the ground as Virginia was ramping up for war. The goal was to restart the Virginia State Armory, which was otherwise known as the Virginia Manufactory of Arms. And Burton said that what he was doing in helping Mr. Anderson at Tredegar was, quote, a labor of love. He really believed in what he was doing. And it was there while he was working at the Tredegar Iron Works that he met up with Mr. Spiller and Mr. Burr, and that his son Charles ended up getting involved working on the revolver factory there in that private endeavor. April of 1861, Virginia secedes from the Union, and Harper's Ferry is summarily set ablaze by the Federals. The arsenal lost a total of 15,000 arms, and the buildings themselves were a total loss. And the Armory, they managed to control the flames and remove the machinery from the buildings there. And it's interesting that Burton organized the machinery removal to get it sent further south. And that's a lot of the machinery that he was working on when he was there creating arms for the United States government, and now he's commandeering it and getting it sent further south for the Confederacy. In June of 1861, Burton becomes the superintendent of the Richmond Armory. He is overseeing the production of the arms that are being made there with the Harper's Ferry equipment that he had captured. And by the end of 1861, he'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he was now in charge of all Confederate States armories. Now this is a little time frame out of order. This picture is his son Arthur Greenwood in 1898, and he's shown wearing his father's uniform. And I show this to you because there are no known photos of Burton in his uniform. So this is the closest we get. Some 30 years after the war, we see his uniform on one of his sons there. I just thought that was an important thing to show. 1862, in the summer, he leaves Virginia and heads to Georgia to open up a new armory down there. Initially, they were hoping to establish the armory in Atlanta, but land prices were on the rise and it drove them to Macon. They end up leasing the Macon and Western Railroad Depot for a cost of $1,000 a year. And their goal is to make 75,000 rifles a year, just as Burton was doing at Enfield. He figured this was absolutely doable. You know, I've done it there, I can do it here kind of thing. But it was a massive undertaking to build this armory. Even though they're leasing the railroad building, you can't run an entire arms factory just out of one building. And so they're building a ton of other facilities there. They end up using 750,000 board feet of lumber, 3 million bricks, 1,280 cubic feet of Stone Mountain granite, 177,000 square feet of manufacturing space when they're done, at an estimated cost of $780,000 without the machinery, just the facilities to put everything in. They had a staff of 144 paid white men, and depending on the time period during the war, they had anywhere between 123 and 273 slaves working on the facility. And the Spiller and Burr factory also moved with him and followed them down to Georgia. In the summer of '63, he heads to England because he's looking to get some new machinery to help complete the armory in Macon. It's not completed, and things are a little bit stalled there. He's trying to get the machinery, trying to get things squared away. And when he gets over to England, he goes back to the Enfield Rifle Works. And it's kind of ironic because when he's there, he finds them tooled up making 8,000 of the Whitworth rifles that he himself a couple years before had totally dismissed. And now Enfield was churning out those guns. He goes into Birmingham, England, and their military market there is at a standstill because there are no United States government orders coming in at the time. And so things are just really, really lagging for him. It took another year for him to be able to get a ship out of England with the equipment that he needed. And unfortunately, because of the blockade, it landed in Bermuda and was stuck there for a number of months as the time keeps ticking by and we're working our way into 1864. You know, he's been trying to get these machines for more than a year to get this armory up and going. And of no fault of his own, he's just stymied one way after another. And then, of course, April 9th of '65, Lee surrenders, and the war is essentially over as history tells it. And when the war ends, the Macon Armory is still not complete. The machinery is still being stuck down in Bermuda. It was a huge undertaking. What the cost ended up coming out to was $2.1 million by the time they put all of the machinery in there. So $780,000 just in the buildings, and then we get $2.1 million. So they end up with $530,000 on small arms machinery, $314,000 on gun stocks and revolvers, and it's all for naught. The building sits empty, the roof fails, and it ends up being torn down a few years after that. Burton is held prisoner until he takes the oath of allegiance in October of 1865 and receives a pardon from Andrew Johnson. Even though the war is over, Burton is still in high gear. He is still all about arms manufacturing, even though the war is no longer going on. And the perfect place for him to do that is back in England. So he hops on a boat and away he goes. He goes back overseas and he runs another armory over in England for another 3 years until 1868. Then in 68 he comes back to Virginia. He's living in Middleburg. He's farming there, but he's restless. He's not happy sitting still being a farmer. He's a machinist. He's a gunsmith. He wants to be making guns. And so he heads back to Leeds. And he inquires about a job there. And before he has the job, he's back on a boat going across. He's that confident that he's going to get the arms making job that he wants. Back over in Leeds. This time the family comes with him when he moves in 1871. He's working for Greenwood and Batley, and he's doing quite well now. They're paying him $5,000 a year, and then they're also giving him $2,500 in moving expenses to get his wife and their umpteen billion kids also brought over. He's also working on negotiating an arms deal with Britain and Russia. I'd mentioned Russia earlier in there. He drew up factory floor plans, machinery, and orders for Berdan rifles for the Russian military. And he was also working with the German military in creating an order of Snider rifles that they had planned on using. Back and forth, back and forth. He's really all over the place. He comes back to Virginia in 1873. He's living in Leesburg. Once again, he cites his health as the reason that he came back. And of course, this time it's certainly more believable. There's no war that he's trying to come back to. So he's living in Leesburg. In the early parts of 1875, he goes up to Chicopee, Massachusetts for the reorganization of the Ames Company that he had worked with back in his Harper's Ferry and Springfield days. And they have reorganized the company there, and Burton is named the superintendent of this facility. But he's not there long. By April of 1875, he comes back to Virginia, and now he's farming again. And he's content for a couple of years, but by 1877, he decides, nope, it's time to go back to England. I am not satisfied quite yet. So then he goes back to England, and then he comes back yet again after another 2-year stint. And so by 1879, he is finally home in Virginia to stay. He retires to Winchester. He buys 205 acres of what is the Pritchard House. It's the Kernstown battlefield today. In 1890, his health is failing and he is no longer able to farm. And so he moves into the city of Winchester proper, into a home called the Maples that still exists in Winchester. So this is the Maples here. And he passes on October 18th of 1894. He's buried in Mount Hebron Cemetery, and his obituary in the local Winchester paper noted that he was, quote, generous, kind, public-spirited, and a man of great learning. Burton led an exceptionally full life. He was all over the place, literally all over the map, and his impact in arms technology cannot be understated or overlooked. With the tolerances that he was working in to get the interchangeability of parts, his development in the mini ball, his working with the British government, the Russian government, the German government on all of these different arms, his efforts to help the arms manufacturing in the South during the Civil War. Burton really did a lot to help for the standardization and the modernization of the arms industry here in North America, because before he got involved in the 1840s, I mean, stuff was one-offs. The concept of interchangeability didn't exist. And he really helped push it into the forefront. And then, of course, without Burton, without James Burton, you don't have his son Frank, and you don't get his developments at the Winchester factory. And so the Burton name, even though when I mentioned at the beginning who here had heard of him, only about half of you, he's definitely someone that we need to know and need to remember, because certainly he was influential during the Civil War, but his reach was far greater than that, and we owe a lot to what we know today in the arms manufacturing industry to James Henry Burton. And so with that, again, my name is Logan Metesh. I appreciate you guys allowing me to come here and speak to you tonight. It's been a pleasure. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoy the channel and the content here and you think you've got even $1's worth of knowledge out of it, head on over to the Patreon page and become a patron there. We've got a bunch of different levels and some awesome swag that you can get as well. There's a link to it in the description. Thanks and have a great day.